I'm Jimmy Nuts from the Fantasy Network, and I'm known for being a bit long-winded, so I'm going to challenge myself to do my top 12 books of 2023 in about 12 minutes or less.
Do we have time for me to tell my New Year's Eve story at the brothel?
Nope, we absolutely have no time, Bobby B, so let's get going. Editing Jimmy here just to let you know, this is only books. No short stories, no novellas, Night of Mannequins, Sand Kings, Death of Eve Village. They will not be included. Only novels in this video. Number 12, Death's End by Cixin Liu. Death's End is the conclusion to the Remembrance of Earth's Past trilogy, better known as A Three-Body Problem, which is being adapted as a show on Netflix. This book wraps up the first Contact story with completely off-the-wall concept and ideas, and borders on the line, in my opinion, of horror. The revelations of the POVs in this story, as well as the biggest character of the story, the human race, is downright horrifying, but also a bit awe-inspiring. I think that this is just a fantastic conclusion. It's a series I think about almost every single week, and I have very high hopes for the adaptation as well. Number 11, Shadows Linger by Glenn Cook. This is the second book in The Black Company, a dark military fantasy series that was started in the 1980s, and this is truly where I think the series finds its charms and its strengths. We have our amazing analyst Croker, who is chronicling this tale of soldiers while also including a third-person POV from a man named Shed, who is a complex character. Shadows Linger ponders the questions of whether or not we are responsible for some of our immorality or terrible decisions based on our surroundings if we are forced into these decisions. This is also a book that borders on the line of horror and has strong Edgar Allan Poe vibes. A monumental entry in a monumental series of fantasy. Number 10, Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. Demon Copperhead is inspired by David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, but takes place in Southern Virginia. It tackles the beginnings of the opioid crisis and the many perils of the foster home system. This was a co-recipient of the Pulitzer Prize in 2023, and it follows Damon, who is, well, called Demon, in a first-person perspective. I found this read to be addicting, no pun intended, and enthralling, even though there's not a ton of action in this story. It stuck with me that Demon Copperhead was able to highlight the tragedy that happens so often in society where our kids are not being taken care of by the people that they should be able to trust, and they actually have to end up taking care of those people themselves as children. It's a very sad story, but I think it's very real. Number 9, The Killer Angels by Michael Shara. Another Pulitzer Prize winner, The Killer Angels by Michael Shara is a Civil War historical fiction about the Battle of Gettysburg. This was the inspiration for the movie Gettysburg, which is positively received by pretty much everyone I know, and the novel spans just a few days, the battle that lasted, and encompasses all the weight for the people involved. Gripping action is on display. Some of the best military action I've ever read in the book, but the most impactful moments, and the ones that really sucked me into this book, were the more reflective moments of the multiple POVs that we get from each side and thinking about the weight that this war has on America. Number 8, The Bone Clocks by David Mitchell. Attempting to put aside my recency bias, this book falls in the list at number 8, but sometimes I've considered this as my favorite read of the year. David Mitchell writes this urban fantasy about Holly Sykes, who is at the beginning of the story a teenage girl hearing voices that could be fantastical or from another plane of existence even. From there, the story takes off and covers many decades and also more POVs than just Holly herself. People age up, you go to different parts of the world, and it stitches together all of these perspectives and almost like short story vignettes. The story is just so cohesive, even though it is scattered about the world, and it's funny, emotional, and full of wonder, and it makes this story fantastical, though very close to home. Number 7, The Shadow of the Torturer by Gene Wolfe, book 1 in the Book of the New Sun. This has been called one of the finest works in science fiction and fantasy, of all time. And it follows the lineage set in place by Jack Vance's Dying Earth. We follow a torturer named Severian as he tells us his story, and at almost every single turn, I am asking myself, is this guy lying to me? This is the best unreliable narrator that I have ever read. This also has some of the most interesting world mysteries, world lore, world history, world building, whatever we want to call it, that I've also ever read. And Gene Wolfe's prose demands attention because there is a story that is being written on the page and then the story that he is writing with words unpenned. And that's what adds a ton of layers to this story. Number 6, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo by Stieg Larsson. A major motion picture and a series that has sold millions upon millions of copies. The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo was well worth the hype for me. Fell in love with Lisbeth Salander from the get-go. A very alternative type of main character, and one that I think interacts with the world in a very different way, even though, a crime, we're going to solve this thing, is a very common story trope but from her perspective and her in the story, it's actually way different. Solving a mystery that has plagued a family for decades, we get all the makings of a family drama, along with the turn of the century technology changing the landscape of how these mysteries can be solved. Phenomenal book, and I will say I like the first book the most out of the trilogy. Number 5, The Trader Barakarant by Seth Dickinson. The first book in the Masquerade series is a slow burn to introduce a secondary world that is experiencing colonialism's impacts. This is standard fare for so many fantasy series, but I feel this one takes the time to show the destruction from the minutiae of systems and everyday life that colonialism can impact. Threads of what makes someone's life work being plucked and pulled until all of it unravels and is stitched back together in a new way that in no way resembles what was there before. It is grim in the most plain, boring ways, but for some reason those hit me harder than a lot of the other stuff that I feel has a bit more shock value than this story. Number 4, A Song for Arbon by Guy Gavriel Kay. A fantasy standalone loosely inspired by 12th century Provence, Arbon is a country where troubadours are highly regarded and love is the trend. The story largely revolves around a conflict between Gorhot and Arbon, with Gorhot being about as opposite as possible. Masculine versus feminine, love versus hate, and these things seem so far apart with a divide, but they are actually a lot closer than it would seem. I think Guy Gavriel Kay kind of balances that line finally. This is why Guy Gavriel Kay is so awesome, and this book is my favorite of his so far out of the 4 that I've read. Number 3, Kindred by Octavia Butler. Octavia Butler released Kindred in 1979 and has since become one of the most impactful science fiction novels of all time. It has been taught in schools, used for community reads, and is still relevant today. A non-linear narrative including time traveling from 1976 California back to a slavery time in the United States, it tackles one of the darkest pieces of American history. Kindred not only makes the list because it's such an important book and it was a very impactful book for me this year, but also because I think it's the best example of writing a strong female protagonist that doesn't have to be Hercules or just a total badass, but one that still has feminine traits and is able to show empathy and compassion and still be fierce when needed to be. And she is just one of the best characters I think I've ever read in fiction, and one that I would love to model myself after. Perseverance is heroic, and that is what Dana is best at. Number 2, Disgrace by J.M. Coetzee. As much as Dana is a model human being from Kindred, Disgrace's main character is all the way in the other direction. A disgraced professor who reconnects with his daughter on a farm gives us the perspective of a very problematic male in post-apartheid South Africa. This is an author who has won the Nobel Prize in Literature, and Disgrace was the last book he published right before that, so it might be indicative of how quality people have found this work. This book excels in its character work in showing how warped sense of sexuality and ego can impact not only the events happening to said person, but also the people who are going through terrible events around this character as well. This book haunted me for weeks and still does, and anytime someone picks it up and messages me and tells me that they've read it, I always kind of feel bad because I know how tough of a read it can be, but at the same time, it has just captivated my mind. And this book tackles gender, racism, and many other themes that are very, very heavy. Reader beware, but I think there's something you can get out of this, and it is certainly an amazing book. Number 1, The Scar by China Miéville. This is not just an endorsement of the second book in the Baslag series by China Miéville, but endorsement of Baslag and China Miéville himself as a whole. Critically acclaimed, China Miéville is one of the most powerful and unique voices that we've ever had in the science fiction and fantasy genre. The Scar is China Miéville, in my opinion, at his very, very best. Tackling themes of love, manipulation, and revolution in the background of a floating city in a plot that is revealing itself piece by piece as the story goes. Characters with their own motivation, history, and faults, it culminates in an unforgettable story that lifts up the Baslag series to excellency, in my opinion. Tolkien had such an in-depth world. We've seen Westeros. There's obviously Wheel of Time. There's so many of these big series that have big, grand world building with a lot of history, and I think China Miéville does such a beautiful job of flexing the imagination and also being able to kind of correlate it a bit to our real world, even though it's a totally secondary world. There are metaphysical elements to this series that have just absolutely blown my mind, and a lot of the people that I've read this with have said that this has been a transformative experience for reading fantasy and sci-fi because it's just really out there. China Miéville is a beautiful writer.
and has characters that are deeply flawed and is not one to beat you over the head with themes, in my opinion. I think that he shows it through a couple different lenses. And for instance, one of the main characters in Perdido Street Station, and also one of the main characters from The Scar, at first you could really just say this is like our good character, our great protagonist. But once you start thinking about his characters, you realize there's a lot to them. There's a lot of different sides to these characters. And on the whole, I think he understands what it is to be human. Poses a lot of questions and will let you maybe come to a conclusion at the end. So I really just think The Scar is full of imagination and themes that are very relevant. And I think people could enjoy this series if they would give it a shot. So that's my ringing endorsement for The Scar. These were my top 12 fantasy books of 2023. And if you want to hear me talk in longer form, I have my 2023 awards here on the channel. That's like a 30-minute video, and I talk about even more books than just these 12. And I hope that you'll go check this out. And I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you like this, you can hit like. If you loved it, think about subscribing. There's a Patreon in the description. It's optional, but always appreciated. Thanks for another great year, everyone. I hope you have a happy new year. Be good, be safe, and remember to always keep turning the page. I want to give a big shout out to all my patrons, including my high tier patrons, my Kingsguard Witches, Bridger, Zan, Adam K, Amel, Curtis L, Jonathan J, Prithvi, Eric B, Chadia, Steve Talks Books, Taylor D, Matthias D, Carlos, Yolanda, Amanda L, John C, John, Garrick, Evie, Henrik, Benjamin C, Sebastian M, Frank C, C. Scott, Jacob Wade, Darren, Jobot, Terrence F, Michael B, Lauren M, Nicholas E, Kai, Kev, Ryan, J, Shad, Amanda V, Ikaika, RJ, Stewart, Oscar, Derry, Tanner, Stromboli Bones, Damon H, and Robert M, Bass, and Kuiper. Thank you all so much. You're the best.